Mark Hill from Greenleaves. So, what an interesting year it has been. There's one aspect I'd like to focus on, and that is not just the electoral results of the year, but the protests that we've had this year. There have been an amazing number of countries that have either had big protests, toppled their presidents and prime ministers. Not just the obvious ones like Hong Kong, which we have seen regularly in the news for about a year now. Algeria, the long-standing president there has been overthrown by protest. Iraq, the prime minister was forced to resign. Long-standing complaints about utilities not working. Chile, the constitution has had to be revised as the only way the president could survive. Sudan, one of the most cruel regimes, has finally lost its president. Bolivia, they removed the president after a disputed election. Ecuador, there's been huge protests about the fuel subsidy. We all know about the situation in Venezuela, which is close to civil war. Then Catalonia in Spain, great protests over the sentencing of the politicians that called the Catalonian referendum and won it. There have been protests in Russia about the hegemony of the Putin regime, a disputed election in Afghanistan. There have been protests which have caused a lot of deaths in Iran due to economic failings and the inability of the mullahs to provide for their people. I don't know if I mentioned Chile. Ecuador, protests over a fuel subsidy. So many countries. The one in Britain that we don't hear about a great deal is the long-standing French Gilets jaunes, anti-fuel tax protests, which are protests of an unusual nature. They're predominantly of rural and small town France against the domination of politics in metropolitan terms. And that has been joined recently by trade union strikes and protests about pension reforms. Really, in the scale of things, the Brexit protests we've seen in the UK are relatively minor, demure, they're peaceful. But what's really striking is just how many of these protests are about the same sort of thing that Brexit is about. And that is about democratic accountability, about the exercise of power. They're about constitutional issues. They're about long-standing corrupt regimes. And our protests against the EU in favour of democratic accountability to a British Parliament that we control, to perhaps subnational government authorities as well. Those are very much in the tradition. They're not that unusual. They've been going on in spades this year in 2019 and undoubtedly will continue next year. Happy Christmas.